Do you think creativity is important in education?
Ooh. Well, creativity is a self-expression. Yeah, so it's important for students to be able to express themselves in their own particular way, and to take what they've learned and stamp their own personality, they put themselves into whatever they've learned to really embody it.
And do you think that when we as teachers we focus on that, do you think that there is adequate reward for allowing students to express themselves and to be creative in terms of the qualifications, in terms of what they're actually there to learn? Do you think it's valued?
No, because it's not really asked for in terms of tests and that kind of thing. And they just want a repetition of what's been learned without referencing any particular creative or personalized aspects. I mean, testing is not looking for creative aspects. So
Yes, so do you think that there is like a shortcoming in that respect, that the testing or the assessment, it doesn't really require students to be creative at all? Do you think that we're letting them down because we're not looking for it?
yeah, personally, I think we are. Yeah, some of the best things I've ever seen from students have been when I just let them off the leash and say, okay, for example, just talk to me next week about something that you love doing, in your own free time, and they just come up with incredible things. Like not just what they come up with, but how they present it. It's all very creative.
And here we're talking about teaching English, right, Paul? Because that's your
Yeah,
subject, right?
particularly talk about teaching English. Yeah.
Yes, and I find that when I was teaching English for a long time, I found it very easy to be creative, both in my teaching and both in what I received from the students, because language is very creative. And so when they get to the point where they're allowed to express themselves in the language, so we are at an advantage there as language teachers, that it's easy to enable creativity with that subject. But think about other subjects, because you probably worked in a school where they weren't just learning the language, they had to learn other subjects too. In the other subjects, do you find that maybe creativity wasn't as easy to focus on in class?
Yeah, probably. I mean, yeah, like as you say, language lends itself to creativity more than other subjects. But I mean, even I remember when I was learning French in school, nobody ever asked for any creative input from the students. It was just following the book and learning the grammar and the rules and the vocabulary, but there was nothing creative at all about it.
And
So,
right. So when you actually used that French you were learning, how easy was it to put into practice what you'd actually learned?
very difficult, because I actually remember after 5 years of French, we went to France and we had a trip there, and we learned the grammar, we learned how to write, but we didn't know how to speak, so we couldn't.
Yes.
Apart from bonjour, when we listened to these people speaking, we didn't have a clue, and we couldn't reply to them.
So that's a great example of what happens when we don't make the teaching creative, because that's the story of so many students who are learning language, as you say, just from the textbook, and when they go to the other country where they've got to implement it, they can't actually use it. Whereas I'm sure that the way that you teach, when it's very creative, your students, when they actually have to speak in English, they can actually do it. They can survive in a situation where they need to use the language. So comparing your own experience with the experience of you teaching the way you teach, what do you think is the difference in terms of delivery and in terms of the impact? What do you think is the difference overall in the way you were taught the language or the languages and the way you teach and the impact that it makes?
Perhaps the degree of formality and sticking to a particular schedule and particular method of teaching. And just the way I was taught was very rote. And it was just based on the book, and you just follow the book. And there was zero allowance for creativity or anything off the book.
And the impact of that, so the impact of that kind of learning was that when you actually went to France, you couldn't actually use it.
Communicate, yeah. You couldn't use the language at all.
Okay. So, and the way you teach, what do you think is how is the impact of the way you're teaching different now?
Well, I'm always looking for student input. I mean, I want them to respond to me. So in any way possible, in any creative way possible. So that's what I'm looking for. That's what I'm always searching for, their own particular expression.
And how would you feel if they said, well, Paul, I went to London for a holiday and I just couldn't understand anyone and I couldn't speak for myself. Have you ever encountered that at all? Have you ever encountered any of your students saying that, all those years they spent in your classes, well, actually, when it came down to it, they couldn't use what you told them or what you taught them?
Yeah, maybe. Well, I didn't hear that particularly. I mean, that specifically, but I can imagine low-level students would respond that way. But most of my students, I mean, they could respond. They could listen to me and respond. Yeah, quite easily.
You mention a very important point there, because there's a difference in the way we teach based on the level of the students. Do you think it's a lot easier to be creative with students who are already at an advanced level of language learning compared with students who don't have 2 words of the language? Do you think it's a lot easier to be creative at the higher levels?
It's a lot easier for everybody to be creative at the higher levels. At the lower levels, then the teacher has to be more creative to teach. I mean, you have to throw in lots of different ways of teaching to get a student to understand, to be able to communicate.
And there's a big difference between teaching creatively and teaching for creativity. A lot of teachers, they're very creative themselves, and there's this kind of confusion between being creative ourselves as teachers and actually enabling students to be creative. So, what do you think is the difference for you in language teaching in terms of actually enabling the students to be creative rather than you coming up with all the creative ideas?
Or just giving them the opportunity, just telling them, so come up with a presentation, and how you present it is up to you. The content is up to you. Mm-hmm. So you're giving them an opportunity there straight away to be creative in their presentation.
So you're giving them freedom, you're giving them choice.
Yeah. exactly. They make the decisions, they make the choices. Yeah.
And again, it's like when they've only got 3 words of English, between the lot of them, it's very difficult to give them freedom of choice.
That's very difficult. Yeah. Yeah. So probably, well, maybe language learning is probably more formal at the beginning, and then when they have some grasp of the language, then you can be a bit more creative.
Yes, so very much of like behaviorism at the lower levels and more of humanism at the higher levels. Would you say that's a fair kind of...
Yeah, as a general thing, yeah.
Because it's all very well giving students this kind of freedom of choice, but when they don't have the ingredients, as it were, to say what they want to say, they don't have the elements, then there has to be that kind of behaviorism, that input. There needs to be a lot of input that takes place before they're actually able to produce something. So it's very unfair, and it can be very unsettling for students when too much is expected of them, when the teacher hasn't actually given them the basics of what they need to use.
Yeah, I would agree.
So in what way do you think culture has an impact on creativity?
I can contrast maybe people from 2 countries I've taught in, Saudi Arabia and Thailand. So it's just the way kids are brought up in Saudi Arabia is very, very formal. And there's very little leeway for self-expression for kids. They're brought up in a very strict religious fashion. Whereas kids in Thailand, they seem to be let loose and able to do whatever they want, in contrast. And there's room for a lot more creativity. And this shows up in the classroom when both sets of people are asked to do something, to come up with something for a project, that they're way more creative in Thailand than in Saudi Arabia.
Can you give me some examples of how they're more creative in Thailand?
Just for a presentation, for example, they'll do different things. Some of them will do little acting skits. Others are doing more formal presentations. There's just a wider range of types of presentation. Whereas in Saudi Arabia, they'll probably all stick to either a formal stand up and talk or do a PowerPoint presentation. That's about it. There's nothing else.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And in terms of input in Saudi Arabia, do the students expect more input from the teacher compared with in Thailand?
Yeah, there might be more questioning of they're not kind of certain of themselves when they're asked to do something creative. They're going to question the teacher and ask, what is it exactly that you want? Whereas in Thailand, you just give them a rough outline and they go run with it and interpret it in any way they want and come up with all these amazing creative presentations.
So thinking about your students, like 10 years down the line or 20 years down the line, in what way do you think this difference will have an impact on their lives in the future?
How much is creativity valued in jobs that they've got since they left university? I really don't know. It's a difficult one to answer. Appreciative of anything creative from their own children or whatever, but I don't know. It's a difficult question to answer.
Yeah, there's a strong link between creativity and diversity. So tied in with the question I've just asked you is about the tolerance of diversity, both ways, like, our own tolerance to others' diversity and tolerance of others to ourselves, being diverse from the norm, as it were. So in Saudi Arabia, do you think, like, what do you think in terms of their tolerance level of diversity? It's, from what I can gather, I've not lived in Saudi Arabia, but it seems to be quite homogenous. So does that, when, or maybe you taught in an international school, which wouldn't be homogenous, but in terms of society overall, do you think that there is a high level of tolerance to diversity or relatively low?
Yeah, there's a range of tolerance. I mean, the more educated classes show more tolerance. So the guys I'm teaching, I mean, they've all got access to the internet. So they've got all this stream of information coming in from outside. And it's pretty much uncensored. So the way they dress, the way they're expressing themselves in different ways, not just wearing the traditional like uniform faux, like the white long shirt that they wear in Saudi Arabia. Some of my guys are coming to class dressed in jeans, t-shirt, and other kinds of dress. There's and they're being taught by foreign teachers. And they're enjoying being taught by foreign teachers. So they are exhibiting greater diversity. So I imagine the educated, younger people are embracing diversity more than say the more conservative and older people in Saudi Arabia.
Okay, and what about in Thailand?
There you got pockets of the country, I don't know, you got the cities, but there's massive diversity because of tourism. Tourism and the tourist industry, which caters to tourists, does encourage a lot of diversity. But out in the countryside, where very few tourists go, I would imagine it's still pretty conservative and less diverse. But you tend to find that people everywhere are very friendly. I mean, even in the conservative countryside, they're extremely open. So I think that diversity is there. I haven't really experienced that in Thailand, where it seems that creativity is valued more. But Saudi Arabia, I remember some students turning up who dressed very much out of the norm, and I remember one particular student. He was shunned. He dressed all in black, and he just looked so different from the rest of the way he dressed and expressed himself. And whenever I saw him outside class, he was always alone. Well, actually, teaching differently to the norm was encouraged by the students because they were used to traditional rote learning systems, which they found very boring. And they literally went to sleep. So when they come across a teacher, the teacher's a communicative style and introduces games and fun activities, they love it. So they can't go back to the boring traditional classroom after that. So it's, yeah.
But even within that, even though you like all of you were adopting the communicative approach, even within that, there might have been, some teachers who kind of did something kind of really, very different to what the others were doing, even within that kind of approach.
Yeah. Well, I can only remember an example of a teacher who was trying to actually convert students to Christianity, which didn't work very well.
No, it's not very creative. No, that's called indoctrination. There's a different word for that. Yeah.
Because the thing in Thailand is that they didn't really give you any textbooks. They gave you an outline of what you were supposed supposed to be teaching, maybe a syllabus, but then it was up to you how you interpreted that and how you taught it.
Mm-hmm.
So that allowed people like this particular guy to come in with his own books,
Mm-hmm.
which I looked at some of them, and they were just all stories about Jesus
Mm-hmm.
and how great he was.
Right, yes.
And yeah, but it was all very traditional type learning.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I talked to some of the students. It didn't go down very well with students.
I wouldn't class that as an example of creativity, but in some of my research I've interviewed teachers who said that they went out on a limb and took their students out on trips, and they got a lot of resentment from their colleagues because the students were missing the other teachers' lessons and things like that. And so because that teacher was kind of going like against the norm, as it were, they were seen to be doing more work than was necessary. They became very unpopular because they were, you know, in being creative that way, it seemed as though they were making more work for their peers. Because sometimes if somebody kind of like goes out on a limb and does much more than is expected, it makes the others feel as if the pressure is on them to also kind of do unpaid hours, you know, because a lot of the creative work, you see, this is the other big thing, is that because usually there's not enough time during the class hours to do things that are really creative, because creativity takes much longer than the traditional approach, as it were. A lot of it has to be done outside of normal school hours in the evening, you know, like extra activities or enrichment activities, and very often there isn't the funding available to make sure that that is paid work. So a lot of the creative teachers tend to do work which is unpaid.
I did work in the public sector in Thailand, and yeah, I mean, I used to take students out at weekends. We'd do for tour guide training, so they'd have to. We just get in a van, and this is all paid for collectively by the students and myself. We put in money towards this,
So
and then we go in
so
a
the
van.
students
And
paid for it. So the students paid for it, but the school didn't pay for it, right?
no,
Yeah, that's
they,
just it. Because not all students can afford it. You know, they can't. Not all
no.
students can afford to pay that extra. So what I'm saying is that in the public sector, funding is only there for what is considered to be necessary. Sometimes there isn't the funding available for the luxury things, and creativity is put into that luxury category, that, well, it's an added luxury, and if people want it, they will pay for it, but the school won't pay for it because they'll only pay for the basics.
Definitely, yeah, definitely my experience.
Yeah, so that tends to be the same wherever. That public sector will consider creativity to be like an optional, thing, that it's not part of the core curriculum. It's just like an optional extra.
Whereas for me, it was absolutely integral, because if they're going to be tour guides, they need to know how to do it, and they had to do the tour guiding on this weekend. You know, they had to be a guide for me. Okay, show me around this temple and tell me about this and tell me about that. That's what they asked them to do, which is exactly what they'd be asked to do when they became tour guides.
Right.
So for me, it was very practical.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
But it wasn't something that was encouraged by the other teachers.
Right.
Or my boss.
So you did that off your own. You took initiative to do that.
Yeah, because I just thought it would be invaluable for them to get the real experience of what it would be like to tour guide, which is where most of them were headed.
Yes.
They wanted to be tour guides in Thailand.
Okay, brilliant.
Get all this information together. What's your aim in long term? You trying to get more creativity into the classroom in the UK, or?
Well, I suppose what I feel after doing my research, when I started out with the research 5-6 years ago, it was about making the business curriculum more creative. But I'm at a place now, Paul, where I've seen, by interviewing my teachers, I've seen that it will be very difficult to make the curriculum more creative. We need to look at creativity outside of the classroom, because of the process. Like incubation is one of the stages in creativity, and we can't be incubating, practically when we're in class, and that's why it's very difficult to measure creativity in class, because you or I, as very creative teachers, we could be sowing the seeds for creativity and sow those seeds really well, but we won't see the fruit of those seeds until maybe 4 or 5 years later. So we can't really measure the impact of how creative we've been in that short space of a time. We only have students for a year or maximum 2 years. In my case, maximum 2 years I would see my students. And so regardless of how creative I've been with them, and regardless of how well I've helped them to develop their skills and creativity, we won't actually see the fruit of that until a long time later. So I usually get messages from my students after they've been to university, like several years after they've actually finished their courses with me. Then they'll say, I still remember that lesson you did, X, Y, and Z. They remember things they did 5 years ago or 6 years ago, but at that time it might have seemed as though they weren't even paying attention to what I was saying, but they remember those things. And so creativity is difficult to measure in tangible, evidence-based outcomes. We have to think of creativity as a process rather than an outcome.